Well, welcome to the final weekend, and I might add the exciting conclusion of our 5-week message series that we've been calling Altitude Adjustment. We think that changing your attitude is the single best thing that you can do to cope with life's problems. And so we're looking at 5 ways that we can improve our attitude by changing our perspective and trying to see our lives the way God sees them. And so far, we've looked at 4 of these transitions. We've looked at moving from an attitude of shame to greater acceptance of ourselves and of how worthy we really are in God's eyes. We've moved from an attitude of dishonesty in maybe some aspects of our lives to greater trustworthiness when it comes to the things of God. And we've shifted from an attitude of complacency to greater care and concern for the poor who are all around us. And then last week we considered another important shift from being a consumer to being a disciple. And what we said was that consumers, they want to acquire more of everything, whether they need it or not. But the life of a disciple is about serving and helping other people. Consumers complain when they don't get their way. Disciples find ways to make things better. Consumers walk away when the next best thing comes along or things get tough. Disciples are faithful and they trust in God even when the job gets hard. And by getting a better perspective on who we were created to be, we can move from being self-indulgent consumers to deeper disciples in Christ. And if you're looking for ways to deepen your discipleship, hop on to the Next Steps section of our website at sthilary.org. Lots of ideas there. Today we're going to look at one last way that we can change our attitude for the better. Now, more than 30 years ago, I had the insane idea of going on a 5-day hike with the Sierra Club through the Maroon Bell Wilderness near Aspen, Colorado. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. Over 100 miles of trails and 9 mountain passes above 12,000 feet. It was a gorgeous, beautiful place to be, but it was also challenging. I was young and in good shape, and I thought, what could go wrong? But somehow, trekking across rough country with a 40-pound backpack, digging my own latrines, going without a shower for the whole trip, sleeping on the hard ground, suffering from altitude sickness, these things never entered into my mind. Something else I didn't think of was the company I would be keeping. See, we were all strangers when we first started on that journey, and most of the people turned out to be delightful. But one man, he was an attorney from San Jose, California, well, he was a handful. He was in his mid-50s, and he was clearly in the throes of a full-blown, all-out midlife crisis. At one point, he just wandered away from the camp for more than half a day without telling anyone that he was leaving. And when he came back hours and hours later, people were really upset with him, especially the leaders. How could you leave? We didn't know where you were. We didn't know whether you were okay. We take responsibility for you. How could you do that? And the public shaming went on and on. And once it was over, I took him aside, which was a little cheeky, I know, because, I was in my mid-20s and he was in his mid-50s. But I did it. I took him aside and I asked him how he was doing. I felt bad for him. Well, the dam broke, and it revealed the depths of his existential crisis. See, he was married with children but couldn't connect with his family. He practiced law, but he absolutely detested, hated his profession. He was Jewish, but found no comfort in his faith. He said he felt all alone in the world. And before long, it became obvious that this man was in deep despair. I don't remember his name, but it might as well have been San Jose Sam, because the pain he was enduring is so common among so many people in our world who have lost any sense of hope and meaning because they lack faith. And I believe that somehow my conversation with him that day was like a seed that was planted in my soul, a seed that later would bear fruit in my ministry as a priest. You see, I have a heart for people who have lost their way in this world. People for whom life no longer holds wonder or joy or even meaning. It's why every Sunday we try to bring hope and encouragement to everyone, to believers and to skeptics alike, through the truth of Jesus Christ. With uplifting music, hopefully inspiring relevant messages, and an environment of radical welcome, we have a sincere desire to love and accept and welcome everyone who watches us online or walks through these doors seeking something that the world out there can never give them. We do it because we firmly believe that there is a way out of that kind of despair. And the way out is an encounter with Jesus Christ. And this is what we see in the gospel passage today. 10 people who are in deep despair encountering Jesus. Jesus encountered 10 lepers today. Now, what you need to know about that is that leprosy was absolutely the worst thing that could happen to you, other than perhaps being blind. Leprosy in that day was a dreaded disease. There was no cure for it or even medicine that could help. And those with leprosy suffered extreme isolation and abject poverty. Skin conditions were believed to be highly contagious, so by law, lepers, once they were diagnosed, were forced to leave their families and live together in colonies away from mainstream society, which is why Jesus found them on the outskirts of town in the gospel story. They were not allowed to enter into the village. They were not allowed to take part in worship at the synagogue or to work at a job or to even beg in the marketplace. They had to scavenge for food in the dumps outside the city instead. And to make it even worse, lepers had to carry around a bell or wear bells around their neck. And when they saw someone, they'd have to ring the bell and they'd have to shout as loud as they could, "Unclean, unclean." It was a warning for others to stay away. Can you imagine how awful that was? It's why in the story, they stood at a distance from Jesus and raised their voice to speak with him. Now, at the end of the story is good news. All 10 lepers were cleansed and their lives were changed forever. But here's the interesting thing. Only one of them expressed gratitude to Jesus for his good fortune. And the burning question is, well, what happened to all these other people? Why did the other 9 not come back and thank Jesus? Most people assume that the other lepers were not grateful. But in reality, few people are ungrateful for what they have. No, most people know that they should be grateful. The problem is that gratitude too often takes a backseat to our darker thoughts. We tend to recognize disappointments before we see the blessings. We zero in on failures rather than focus on successes. We direct all of our attention to the problems and the setbacks in our lives instead of giving thanks for prayers that have actually been answered. No doubt, most people want to be grateful. Keeping gratitude journals, lighting candles, writing thank you cards, all great ideas. But somehow, negativity threatens to creep in before we can get very far. Psychologists call it a negativity bias that we all have. And so it seems that a lot of us could use maybe some help to grow in gratitude. And so the altitude adjustment that we're looking at this week is the move from an attitude of negativity and despair to one of gratitude. So let's go back to the gospel and see what we can learn there. There's actually 4 tips for tapping into the power of grateful living. Here's tip number 1. Call upon the source of every blessing. We all like control over our lives, right? I know I do. You probably do. You want to feel like you're in control, but sooner or later, we all have to admit that we're not fully in charge of our destiny. And the more we're willing to admit that, the more grateful we'll end up being. The lepers in the gospel story, they knew there was no way that they could on their own reverse the misfortune that had come upon them. They understood that only a higher power could free them from the curse of leprosy. And they were willing to name that higher power in the very first words that they uttered. Do you remember those first words? Jesus, Master. That's what they cried out. Jesus, Master. They realized he was the source of what they hoped would be a blessing in the cure from leprosy. Now I imagine that most of us here, most of us watching online, many of us at least, are people of faith, varying levels of faith. And so it seems obvious, of course, I recognize that God's in charge of my life. But when you're in great need and your world seems to be falling apart, it's sometimes hard to remember that. When your world is falling apart because of grief or addiction or bankruptcy or loneliness or some other kind of hurt or abuse or problem, we focus in on ourselves and we try to control the problem ourselves. And so, are you able to cry out like the lepers, Jesus, Master? Are you able to find the humility within yourself to call upon the true source of every blessing and beg him for help? Gratitude begins with our willingness to name who's really in charge and then to bow humbly before him. Here's the second tip for grateful living that comes from the gospel. Recognize your true poverty. See, if you don't think you need anything from God, you'll never ask for anything, and you'll never be grateful for anything. The next words out of the mouths of the lepers after saying, Jesus, Master, were exactly this: have pity on us. Have pity on us. They were asking for God's mercy. They knew their poverty. They knew how poor they were. They had been suffering for too long, and there was no denying their suffering. The question for us is that, do we recognize how poor we really are? How much we really need God's mercy and compassion? Perhaps the single most common reason for human ingratitude, I think, is the belief that we don't really need anything. Now again, many of us are people of faith here. So obviously our answer is going to be, yes, I know that I depend on God for everything, but how about deep down, subconsciously? Subconsciously, many of us can be lulled into thinking we don't need things from God. Until disaster strikes, life can seem pretty good, right? Especially here in Tiburon. Your kids are probably getting top grades at school. You're having great success in business. You have a wide circle of friends, a loving family, a nice home, a certain standard of living. All of those are good things. But they can cleverly convince us, subconsciously at least, that we really don't need anything from God. And that single fact alone is why affluence and faith are often opposed to each other. The more affluent people are, studies have found, the less religious they tend to be. Who needs God when you have everything already? but without the sobering recognition that all of it could be taken away in an instant. Without the realization that even with all the good things we do have, that we still stand as beggars before God. Without that realization, gratitude is impossible. Gratefulness demands that we recognize the deep existential chasm within us that can only be bridged by God's merciful love. Well, here's the third tip for grateful living. And this one, for me, is the hardest one. Expect blessings. Expect blessings. In the gospel, Jesus commands the lepers to go and show themselves to one of the priests. And why did he do that? Well, according to Jewish law, no one with a skin disease claiming they were cured could re-enter society unless they first went to a priest to be checked out. But here's the amazing thing about the story. They went. The lepers started off on the journey to Jerusalem, which was several days away by foot. And they did it before they had been healed. Think about that for a minute. Would you have done that? Jesus is standing right in front of you. You've undoubtedly heard about all the people he's healed, but now he says, go. He just sends you packing with no explanation, no assurance that you will ever be healed. What would you have done? I think I would have stood there and said, Jesus, please heal me now. But see, that's the whole point of the story. The lepers trusted him. They had faith they would somehow be healed if they followed his instructions. So when things look grim in your lives, when there seems to be no hope, when your best days appear to be behind you, can you believe that greater blessings are ahead from God? That they're just around the corner? Will you trust that God's mercy lasts forever? Will you have faith that better days are ahead? And you'll get that new job, or the doctors will find a cure, or your sadness will come to an end, or your kids will finally get on the right path. Yes, we all believe that God has blessed us, but can you believe it will happen again in the future? Will you believe, like those lepers believed, that God will make good on his promises? If you can, then you will grow in gratitude. Here's the last tip for grateful living. Remember to give thanks. As the lepers were going, they were cleansed, and then one of them, realizing that he had been healed, came back and thanked Jesus. And of course, Jesus is disappointed that only one of them returned to give thanks. There's many possible reasons for that. Maybe the others didn't realize that they had been cured. Maybe they were afraid to deviate from Jesus' instructions. I mean, he said, go to Jerusalem. He didn't say, turn around and come back when you're healed. Maybe they were too far along on the journey and they thought that Jesus had probably already moved on. Whatever the reason, Jesus pushes past his disappointment and he says to the man, stand up and go. Your faith has saved you. And so he says to you and to me, to each of us who recognize our deep need, our poverty, before the true source of every blessing, to each of us who believe that God will not delay in sending his blessings, to each of us who remember in our hearts to give thanks for every blessing, Jesus says to us, stand up and go. Your faith has saved you. I don't know what ended up happening to that disheartened man who shared with me his discouragement and pain so long ago. I don't know if he reconciled with his family, if he made it to retirement, if he somehow found faith, or even if he's still alive. But I do pray for him. And I pray for every person who struggles to find hope in this world. What do I pray for? A change of heart, a better attitude, an improved perspective. But most of all, I pray that every one of us may have the courage to move from an attitude of negativity, discouragement, despair, hopelessness, to true and lasting gratitude.